When I was maybe 11 or 12 and still living with my parents, I woke up suddenly one morning to see that the door to my room was open. Strange, but nothing to be worried about. Maybe one of my parents was just checking in on me and forgot to close it last night. My eyes were still blurry from my time in dreamland, and so as I rubbed them in that early morning light, probably around 6 in the morning, it took me an extra second to realize there was someone standing behind the door, mostly obscured by it, so I could only just see the dark outline of their shoulder and the side of their head, like they were peeking. It was a shorter figure, so I guessed it was one of my brothers, but I didn't say anything for some reason. I just watched. After a second, the figure darted away, as if it had noticed I was staring at it. At that moment, I suddenly was struck with the urge to follow. If it was one of my brothers, I needed to get mad at them for being in my room in a way that only an older sibling could, and I jumped out of bed and ran to follow it. I was only a second or two behind, but as I turned into the hallway, I saw nothing there. Except the open door to my parents' bedroom. It was usually closed. I peeked my head into their room, curious to see whether or not they were awake and could explain what was happening, but they weren't. As far as I can tell, I was the only one awake in that house. I watched, very confused, as a heavy leather photo album, part of a set my parents kept at the top of their dresser at the time, began to shift from its place, being dragged by nothing and no one to the edge of the dresser, where it suddenly fell with a loud and I ducked back out of the room as my parents began to stir. As I walked back into my room, I found my copy of The Half-Blood Prince laying on the floor. It had been there when I left, I just hadn't noticed it. Now, I was a pretty messy kid, and my room often existed in a state of disorganization, but I really cared about my Harry Potter books growing up. They were part of the reason I became a reader to begin with, and so they were one of the only things I actually took the time to shelf every day. They sat on a shelf above my dresser, one I'd have to stand on the bottom drawer of to reach, so there was no reason for it to be on the ground. Even if it had fallen, it would have landed on the dresser. I thought back to how suddenly I awoke, and how my parents were probably waking up confused now, with a book on their floor. In that moment, as an 11 or 12-year-old, I came to the conclusion that something I couldn't fully comprehend or understand, had been trying to wake us up. I didn't know why, and I didn't care. Now, the interesting thing about growing up with a memory like this is how, over time, you become more and more convinced that you've misremembered something, that you've tied unrelated circumstances to each other and scared yourself. I, for all my horror passion, do not believe in ghosts, at least not in that way, and so the only logical conclusion I can come to about this memory is that I've doctored it. Maybe it was my brother playing a prank. Maybe it was me playing a prank, and I got it all so backwards that I tricked myself into thinking I was the victim and not the perpetrator. Whatever the case, I still remember so clearly something happening in my home that couldn't be explained. And that memory, fake or not, has led me, in part, to becoming the horror fanatic I am today. One of my favorite things about horror in the modern era is that, by now, we figured out a way to tell a horror story in just about every setting imaginable. Outer space, the bottom of the sea, on top of the sea, in completely fictional realities, and also in completely historical realities. Obviously, this is applied more to pieces of visual horror, movies, and games, where setting needs more work than just a good description, but across the board, we're just spoiled for choice when it comes to interesting locations to tell our tales of terror and woe. However, even saying this, I have a particular fondness for the places that I would describe as traditional horror locations. Graveyards, abandoned hospitals, cabins in the woods, you know the type. They're the kinds of places that you could reference any number of horror icons in at once. For instance, is the horror of those dark woods an evil witch, or a vengeful slasher, or the trees themselves? It could be any of them, or something else, because the woods represent so much mystery and intrigue, are a separate, more wild ecosystem than we regularly participate in, and famously have held many mysteries throughout actual human existence. And so, different horror creators, regardless of the full story they're trying to tell or the point they're trying to make, will use the woods as their backdrop because we are so easily placed into a horror-adjacent mindset at just their appearance. You can apply this kind of logic to many of the other traditional horror locations creators use. An abandoned hospital is scary because what are those stains? questions. Who's making those footsteps? What was done here, and why did it shut down? As I ask these questions and describe the horror, what experience are you imagining? Grave Encounters? Silent Hill? Outlast? It could be any of them. But there's one location that stands above all the others, the definitive spooky location. A setting that I would say, with almost complete certainty, that every real existing horror fan has encountered probably more than once. It's a setting that is uniquely effective because of our relationship with it, and it's one that traces back to some of the earliest days of written legend. The haunted house. Before talking about the house itself, I want to talk about 5 or 6 things that traditionally a house can be haunted by. My research for this is, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a ghost hunter because I watched all kinds of paranormal investigation shows in the morning before my parents woke up. One day, I bought this book called The Ghost Hunter's Survival Guide by Michelle Belanger, or Bellinger, or however it's pronounced. And when I tell you that book never left my side, I'm not exaggerating. Walking around my own house, my friends' houses, my school, the park, pretty much anywhere, I needed to have that book on me. What if a rogue specter appeared and I didn't have my trusty guide to tell me what to do? I was Dipper Pines with his journal, except my book was a lot less valuable and only covered a very specific type of the paranormal. One thing that has always stuck with me from that book, however, are the classifications of paranormal entities it gave. There were 3 you would normally encounter when investigating a haunted location. The first is a ghost, in the most traditional sense of the word. An entity that appears in form and sound only, but that is incapable of interacting with anything physically. The way a ghost was described in the book was less of a conscious figure and more of an echo. When someone does something over and over in their life, or suddenly and dramatically, residual energy is left over, for whatever reason fits within the framework of your reality. Maybe it's the soul, maybe it's energy in a more modern understanding, maybe it's a phenomenon of physics we haven't even recorded yet. Whatever the case, the main distinguishing point of a ghost, as I understand it, is a certain mindlessness. A ghost doesn't know it's a ghost because, and this will vary depending on the story or who you ask, a ghost doesn't know it's dead, or potentially anything at all. The part of the human spirit that the actual personality, desire, and mind are attached to is moved on, and all that remains is a likeness. It's kind of like zombies, that whole line of, "That's not Brad anymore, Brad's gone."
I'm sorry, Mom.
Except the stakes are usually a lot lower. A ghost, to me, is most interesting in a historical context. If you're buying or staying in an old location with an unknown or mysterious history, ghosts are almost always clues to solving that mystery. It's not pointed at you per se, so you won't have a revelation like, "Oh, I need to dig up their bones in the woods," but you might have something like, this person was agoraphobic and never left, and that's why there's a ghost here. But also why certain things in this place are structured the way they are, why there are dumbwaiters and a delivery box near the front porch, and dark shutters over all the windows. It's a story told through context clues, which I love. The second entity is what I think a lot of people would call a ghost, but it has a different rule set. The book calls it a spirit, and the main distinguishing feature is that a spirit does have a consciousness. Stories about unfinished business and lingering regret have to do mostly with spirits over ghosts because there's an element of personal tragedy to them. A ghost can appear simply through repetitive action, but a spirit has to have a reason for being there, even if they don't know it themselves. A spirit can do more than a ghost, can act independently and make choices, but it's still limited by its form. Most spirits cannot physically interact with the world, and those who can generally can only do so in small ways, like flickering lights or creating cold spots. A spirit generally shows up for intensely personal reasons. Unfinished business, like mentioned before, or maybe to watch over something or someone they cared about. Maybe because they died before they could realize it was happening, or any other reason you might come up with to stick around after you died. There can be good spirits, like your grandmother watching over you, and there can be bad spirits, like your other grandmother watching over you. I recently watched the 2017 movie A Ghost Story, and despite its title, it's a really great example of a classic spirit. After a tragic and non-specific death, a man, Casey Affleck, is unable to move on from the house in which he resides, as he watches his former partner process his death and move on, or at least try to. He is desperate for one last moment with her, one last connection, to finish his story with her, and so he lingers in the space, even after she's gone, watching time pass and new people take over the space. It is heartbreaking and beautiful and horrifying all at once, watching reality move forward around someone stuck in one moment. I cannot recommend this movie enough. The spirit is literally a man covered in a sheet. It is phenomenally simple in its presentation and yet deeply chilling. There's not really an antagonist though, other than death and the way it separates. The spirit is not evil, though it does become upset at times. It's just there, tragically. However, the worst kind of spirit is what we're talking about next. A poltergeist is a spirit that is so angry, sad, or confused that it can interact with the real world and usually in a rather violent way. Their motivations are usually similar to that of a spirit wanting to complete something or process their own death, but the actions they take to accomplish this goal tend to be more destructive, if not at least more noticeable. These are the best spirits to make a horror movie about. A great example is the film Poltergeist, for obvious reasons. However, there is a lore to the later bits of that film that isn't necessarily universal to the typical poltergeist encounter. Another example I can't help but bring to mind, just because of my childhood, are the orange, big-headed poltergeists from Luigi's Mansion 2: Dark Moon. Are those an accurate portrayal of poltergeists in reality? Sort of, but really, I just like them. Dark Moon is awesome. I just started playing it again. I think most paranormal horror stories tend to be technically about poltergeists, because there's not really a more intense entity you can encounter without going into demonic territory, which we'll get to in a second. Ghost stories, especially modern ones, often run into the problem of how do we make this entity more intimidating? And a lot of the time, the solution is to make your ghost a poltergeist, because you're simply increasing the options for haunting that are available. The ability to interact with the world in a meaningful way changes the game for a ghost, regardless of their motivations, if they even have any. So these three types of specters, the ghost, the spirit, and the poltergeist, all tend to take part in what we might call a traditional haunting. However, each of their methods of haunting would be starkly different. A ghost wouldn't have the mental bandwidth to formulate a goal further than walk to that room or sit in that chair or whatever, so their form of haunting would be purely observational, meaning the only way an inhabitant of the space could become aware that a haunting was even happening would be seeing the specter firsthand, or hearing it potentially. A spirit would likely be more communicative, lacking a poltergeist strength though. Each encounter would have to be that much more pointed. The lights would flicker right as you entered a room, not because they were flickering before, but because how else does a ghost get your attention? You know that meme that started around the release of the first Paranormal Activity movie that was just like, why do ghosts even bother doing minor things like opening a cabinet or dropping a mug? Well, it's because there's not really another option for them. Maybe it doesn't need your attention, maybe it just wants to watch, but either way, the effects of a haunting will be less trackable because they're being actively performed rather than repeated like a ghost. And of course, that's just taken to its extreme in the case of a poltergeist, who will throw shit around the room. A poltergeist is like a ghost having a temper tantrum. In fact, a poltergeist doesn't have to use objects in space. It can even interact with its victim firsthand, with reports of biting, tripping, pushing, and pinching coming from recorded poltergeist encounters. God, it's fun to believe in this stuff again, even just for a video. You might have noticed, though, that even though the book had only 3 entities for a traditional haunting, I listed 5 or 6 as potentially being responsible for haunting a house, and those require a little explanation, so let's go through them now. A house can be haunted by a demon, which is different from a ghost unless you're going by the medieval European definition that splits ghosts into 2 categories, the souls of the dead and demons. But either way, you know what I'm talking about when I describe a demonic haunting. It's like a poltergeist, but the stakes are way higher, and usually there's some form of possession or at least demonic influence. Even when they're not actively controlling a victim, demons are often said to carry with them an evil and influencing energy so that tensions rise in their vicinity and people become more irritable, violent, and susceptible to their influence. Demons are not just based out of the Christian faith and tend to appear in one way or another across many religions and spiritualities. However, in America, we are usually more familiar with the Christian version of this, with movies like The Conjuring or The Exorcist putting a heavy emphasis on the exorcism-type possession, which utilizes things like the crucifix, biblical passages, and holy water as a universal solution, at least in fiction. Exorcism is an actual recorded practice in the Catholic Church, though they happen infrequently and likely look different than how they're often portrayed in fiction. Another thing that can haunt a house is the house itself, and this is honestly one of my favorite types of haunting stories. Setting is just so important in horror, so if you can make the setting itself the antagonist, you've captured a really interesting and unique angle. Stuff like House of Leaves or The Haunting of Hill House are great examples. Also, Anatomy by Kitty Horrorshow. Jacob Geller actually has a full video on this concept. It's fantastic and you should go watch it after this. The point is, sometimes a house develops a personality over time, whether literally like in Anatomy or House of Leaves, or more figuratively, like when it's left abandoned for a long time, or something tragic happens in it. Have you ever walked through an abandoned house and gotten the sinking feeling as you considered what caused it to be abandoned? An energy forms, and depending on who you are, that energy again might have a different name. Maybe spirit, maybe personality, maybe soul, but no matter what, the atmosphere, the very nature of the setting, is changed from a simple collection of walls, floors, and ceilings to something alive. When you enter its walls, it's less like entering a cave that you know a bear is in. It's like walking right into a bear's stomach. What I mean is, there's not an entity somewhere in here waiting to get you. The entity is the here. You feel like you're being observed as you walk past faded pictures on the wall. The creak of the old wooden stairs feels like a groan of pain, like you're stepping on a cavity or tumor. Body horror, a type of horror I'll be making a video about sometime soon, can actually weirdly be applied in a lot of surprising situations, one of which being within the haunted house. Say a house has developed a personality, or even just a consciousness through whatever means. What does renovation feel like to a living building? Is peeling the old wallpaper like flaying a creature alive? When you rewire things, is it like you're playing around in its veins? When you knock down a wall, are you breaking a rib? When you take out that old brick fireplace, you might be smashing into a windpipe. I guess the point I'm making is stop remodeling antique houses and making them boring. You're literally killing your house. That's not really my point, but seriously. We'll talk more about the personality and energy of a home in a second, the reasons that such a perspective like this, that a house might haunt itself, could appear in the first place. But first, we have to finish this section by talking about the most abstract form of haunting, which is when a house is haunted by a person, like a living person. The first and easiest way I can describe this is with the instance when a house is not haunted and a person, through whatever means or circumstances, convinces themselves that it is. You know that classic, oh, the creak on the stairs was just the house settling, or oh, that ghostly moan was just the wind. Take that, but do it oppositely, taking regular phenomena and explaining them supernaturally. There are plenty of reasons someone might do this, other than just making a mistake. They could have a neurological issue that makes them more susceptible to the belief that there are other entities around and interacting with them. There could be a gas leak, which historically tends to create strange and manic behavior in affected individuals who don't know it's happening. The person could just be lonely or enduring tragedy or loss and desperate to feel seen, even under supernatural circumstances. Who knows? I find this type of haunting deeply compelling and also deeply tragic, but it's not the only living haunting that can happen. It can be about another person, one who is definitively alive and extant. There are a couple ways this can happen. Say you moved in with a partner, but something happened in your relationship, and now they're no longer with you. However, the room they used to work in still has a coffee stain from their mug. There are dusty rectangles on the walls where their artwork used to hang, and the bed you bought together now feels much too large. The person isn't dead, but their absence lingers, not just inside you, but in the space that they used to exist in a lot. That sounds like a ghost to me. Or what about this? One of your parents is just a real piece of work. Maybe it's substance stuff, maybe it's physical, maybe it's something else. It doesn't matter. The point is, this is a person you have to be cautious of, that you might be afraid of. That changes your mood with just their presence. Maybe you're already in the house and you can feel the atmosphere darken as they enter, just off the sound of their footsteps alone, or by the way that everyone else in the house who feels the same as you also seems to shrink into quiet caution. That's a scarier sort of haunting than any ghost or spirit I can think of. The first ever recorded ghost story was written around 245 BCE by the Roman author Plautus, and it's called Mostellaria, which translates loosely to the ghost play. It takes place in Athens, and may be an adaptation of an earlier story. Centuries later, around 60 CE, a man named Pliny the Younger sent a series of letters to his friend Licinius Sura about a large house in which the specter of a man in chains had begun haunting, a haunting which caused the house to be abandoned. This is regarded as potentially the second or first account of a true haunted house in history. We've been telling stories of haunted houses for as long as we've been telling stories, and that has primarily to do with two very human qualities. One, we are consistently grappling with the concept of our own mortality, and just about every ghost story, with minor exception, implies to some degree or another that death is not the complete end of one's story. A narrative which serves both those dealing with the mortality of a loved one and those dealing with their own mortality. Two, houses, or more accurately, homes, are the epicenter of our lives. They hold our belongings, our resources, our family and memories, and our safety. If you're trying to tell a horror story or a cautionary tale, especially in an older era, there is no setting that will be more effective than the one place we are meant to have safety and comfort. And that's the big draw of haunted house stories, I think. They represent a sharp contrast between a house's intended purpose and what can actually go on in them. Think back to the last entity example I gave, the human haunting. In a perfect world, a house is built to hold a healthy, loving, functional family. And so, when the inhabitants are are not that, it creates a surreal and chilling environment. If you push this to a supernatural degree, houses are meant to hold things that are alive. And so when something dead is moving around in there, something the dead were also not supposed to be capable of, you've infected the entire space. That's another thing about stories of hauntings, in general really, not just for houses, and especially when a setting is haunted by just one thing. It's strange for the entire context of a location to be so heavily affected by the inclusion of just one factor. When you bring a dog into a house, that doesn't make it a dog house. When you bring a meal into a house, that doesn't make it a restaurant. But when you put a ghost into a house, then it always becomes a haunted house. And that also becomes the most important thing about it. There is no string of adjectives that you could put together to describe a house that would include a descriptor more interesting and deserving of follow-up than haunted. Which is why, weirdly, there's an actual market for haunted houses. Why? Well, for one thing, there's a precedent that allegedly haunted houses are less expensive, usually because there's been a death on the premises, but in our current era, that could be enough as is. But further, as I'm sure I don't have to explain to you, there are also people who are so fascinated and excited by the macabre and the paranormal that for simply aesthetic reasons alone, they would knowingly seek out a haunted house. The draw of a haunted house, speaking anecdotally for a moment, is insane. There are houses everywhere and most of them are not haunted, probably, but that makes it so much more exciting when you actually find one. It can be fun in a touristy way, like going to New England where every other house is allegedly haunted and people do tours and walkthroughs all the time, but it's that much more alluring when you discover it on your own, or at least if it's a bit quieter. I think a lot of the Neibolt house from Stephen King's It, how the town tended to treat the place. Now, obviously, in It, and especially the more recent adaptation, there are other forces at play in the reactions that the town has to the goings-on within, but the way our protagonists, the Losers Club, treat that house is exactly the way that it feels to encounter a place like that in real life. You stand in front of it, making up or repeating insane stories about its history or what happens behind its doors now, daring each other to go in and just enjoying its presence as a part of your reality. It's kind of this energy that can allow for a house to become haunted by itself. Even if it's totally innocuous on the inside, if enough stories have been told and enough dread has been built, it doesn't matter what you find in there. You're in a haunted house, haunted by the fact that you've deemed it haunted. As I mentioned earlier, I don't really believe in ghosts. I'm not so bold to say they don't exist outright, and I love the idea, especially in the face of having had weird encounters growing up, but it's just not an idea I can force myself to take seriously. However, I will say that when you stand at the threshold of a place like that, a horror story in a bottle confined in one space, you can't help but feel some trepidation and excitement. In fact, I have a really hard time going into haunted houses, even just the Halloween attractions. The last time I tried, I had a panic attack and we had to leave. It's just something about the space, how all-encompassing the mysterious atmosphere is, how uncertain I become. What if there is something? And if there is, how wild is it that it's just sitting there, trapped in a building, just like all the other buildings around? And that's the real draw of haunted house stories, above anything else. They are incredibly accessible, and that makes them strikingly alluring. It feels like we should have to go on some grand adventure to encounter something as reality-shaking as an animated spirit, and yet there are countless stories of them just being in a place you could drive to, that you could stumble upon while walking in an older part of town. Haunted houses are the horror of the proletariat. We don't need your ancient stone castles or your restricted catacombs. We just need a building and a dead guy. Really, if we're being honest, the haunted house story has survived for so long because it's the most intimate type of horror we can encounter. It is based 100% on our own perception and reaction, and so every haunted house becomes not only a reflection of the spirit allegedly lingering within, but also the explorer, you, as you take in the environment and decide its nature for yourself. It's personal, it's subjective, and above all, it's just fun. Haunted houses. We love them.